Hey everybody, it's Jim from Radio Wasteland. It has been a tough week here in Midland County. As many of you know, the floodwaters went through beginning on Tuesday, May 19th, forcing the evacuations of nearly 11,000 people. We're pretty lucky that there were no major injuries or any deaths in that evacuation and subsequent flood. But now that the waters are going down, lots of folks are heading back to their homes and they're finding out the extent of that damage. We have some friends of the store who have already gotten into contact with us to say that their record collections have been completely destroyed in this disaster. Now, I know in the grand scheme of things, a record collection is just a possession that can be replaced. But many of us spend years and years putting these collections together, and they're a very important part of our lives. And I'm not trying to diminish the other losses that come into this, because all of that is tragic, whether that be a record collection or furniture or family heirlooms. All of that is painful to lose, especially in an event like a flood. And by the way, I am speaking from experience. Nearly 20 years ago, our basement flooded out at home, but luckily I was able to get the albums out before it got too bad. And so we didn't suffer any damage in that. But I have had water damaged records in the past from smaller incidences in the basement, as I'm sure many of you have as well. So I thought we'd put together a little video today, though, to give some tips on what to do if your records, if the worst ever happens and your records do get caught in a flood or get wet or get some sort of moisture on them. There are a few things you can do, not to completely save them, but at least minimize the damage, especially if it's a rare piece of vinyl. First and foremost, make sure the area is safe for you to get into. If there's standing water, make sure there's no power in there, or make sure that the water can be drained out before going in to try to salvage your records. If it's sewage water that backs up, things are going to get a lot more difficult because, quite frankly, that smell will not come out of your outer sleeves. If it's regular backed up river water or sump water that comes up, you stand a better chance of saving things than you would otherwise. Once you get in there, get your records out of that wet situation as quickly as possible. You want to separate the vinyl from the outer sleeves and get that drying. Do not let your vinyl, by the way, dry in the sun. We all know what happens to that. But if you wait too long and let's say you leave them in a crate and the records have a chance to dry, the outer sleeves, something like this will happen, where the outer sleeves will stick together and they will not come apart without causing major damage to that outer sleeve. Inner sleeves, the same thing is going to happen. You're likely to get some water damage and wrinkling on those. A worst case scenario, they could also stick inside the cardboard inside, depending on how much you let that dry. A lot of times, if it's just wet, the vinyl, if you can get it out of there quickly enough, will be okay. You are probably going to end up with some damage on your labels in some cases not. But if you can get the vinyl out of the water quickly enough and get it to dry, you should be okay with that. If you get your sleeves out in time and get them dry, hopefully you can get away with just minimal wrinkling. But again, if worse comes to worse, you may have to replace outer sleeves. Finding exact replicas or other versions of the release is one way to go, and that's probably the more preferable way to go, especially if your vinyl is still good. But in the short term, you may want to consider replacing those outer sleeves with generic ones. You can get a hold of these fairly easily. We have them available at the Wasteland as well, but this will give your records some protection until such time as you can either replace the outer sleeve or get something new. The same thing with inner sleeves. If those inner sleeves are ruined or wet, get some paper inner sleeves at least to store the vinyl in once you get that dried off as well. Now, let's say you can't get to those records as quickly as you'd like to. Something else bigger has come up that's demanding your attention, especially in a trying time like a flood. And so you put that off. And when you get to them, you find the crate that they were in still sitting there soaking. There's a good chance that those are going to begin to mold over, especially if you let them sit for a longer period of time, just figuring they're going to dry out. Once that happens, the outer sleeve is done. You might as well get rid of it. You can do some cleaning to it. If it's a minor amount of mold, you can do some deodorizing work on it. At the store, we clean outers with just some regular Lysol or Lysol wipes. These are hard to find, by the way, right now. So you can get a little bit of it off of there, but if it's inside the outer sleeve, it could be pretty much useless and you're not going to get that back. If mold gets onto a record, that can be tricky also. I mean, we use, and you guys know that we use the spin clean system here, and if the mold gets into the records, what you're going to want to do is protect yourself first, especially if you've got allergies like I've got allergies. Use some gloves. Get a hold of one of these hard to find surgical masks as well, so you're not breathing in the mold to get that, and you can run it through a cleaner. Here is an example of a record that has not fared very well. One side of it, I'm not certain what has happened. It is molded over, it's sat for too long, and does need to be cleaned. We'll do a later video on this at some point to see if we can save it. But what you want to do, though, is get your records into a cleaner, whether it be a spin clean or another one, to try to get some of that mold off of that as quickly as you can. Now, absent the spin clean system, again, we do recommend that, but absent the system, you can get a hold of a microfiber cloth fairly easily from a dollar store. Get a little bit damp, get another one, and then just wipe your records down with some distilled water. Get a hold of them and get that wet, lay it down, and just clean with the grooves. If they're really dirty, you got to be very careful that you're not scraping the dirt across those grooves. That's why a brush system like the spin clean would work best for you. But again, if you don't have access to something like that, do the next best thing with a microfiber cloth and do your best to clean that out, and then let them dry as much as you can. Now, let's say the worst has happened and you've lost your entire collection, whether it be to a flood or a house fire or something equally tragic. There are ways to deal with the insurance companies regarding this. It depends on your coverage and whether or not you've had those records entered into the items that are covered in your household coverage. But you'll need to work on replacement values. We utilize Discogs here at the store for a great deal of our inventory, as many of you know. But that can also be very, very helpful in a situation like this. If you've gone through the effort to enter in all of your items into the Discogs database and add them to your collection, you now have an off-site listing of your records. If you've gone through the details, the real finely detailed releases in Discogs, you can pinpoint the release of yours, and that could make it a little easier to replace. Or you could just do generally saying, I had a copy of this. Either way, that listing in Discogs in your collection will give you an idea of the value of your collection and the records that you would like to replace should the worst happen. To do that, you just simply log into your Discogs account and navigate to the collection tab. And at the top of that collection tab, you'll see a listing of 3 different numbers showing the minimum, the average, and the maximum value of all of the records that you have logged into that particular collection or folder. So that's a good way to keep track of that, and you can actually export that database out and have that as a file or as a printout to take to your insurance again should the worst happen. Now let's say you have not been using Discogs, but you're older school and you have a printout or some other database or a spreadsheet listing your albums. You can easily log into Discogs at that point and look those albums up to get an approximate value of that for your insurance purposes. Hopefully these tips have helped out a little bit. Whether you're in this situation now with the Midland floods, or you think you may ever be in this situation where you're faced with losing a collection, or even a crate or 2 of records that were left on a floor that become damaged. It's not fun, we do know that. But remember, in the long run, the records are replaceable. And as much as it sucks to go through this, sometimes half the fun is finding these. And so you get to go through that again. No big solace for those of you going through it now, I understand, but you got to do what you got to do sometimes. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time from the Wasteland.